That pane of glass in your wall is a quiet, passive observer. You look through it every day, watching the seasons change, the rain fall, a neighbor walk their dog. It is so fundamental to the concept of a room that we barely notice it's there. But what if that simple sheet of silica is one of the most powerful and underrated technologies in human history? What if the variability to install a flat, clear window was a silent catalyst for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution? This is not just a story of architecture. It is the story of how looking out fundamentally changed how humanity looked at the world, connecting your living room to the birth of modern science. Today, we pull on this unseen thread and discover the world it unravels. Our journey begins not with a pane of glass, but with its absence. For most of human history, a home was a fortress against the world. An opening in the wall was a profound vulnerability. The very word window finds its roots in the Old Norse vindaga, meaning wind eye. A poetic but brutally honest description of a hole that invited chilling drafts, driving rain, and unwanted pests. Early architectural records show us a constant, desperate struggle to solve this dilemma. How do you let light in without surrendering to the elements? For centuries, the solutions were translucent, never transparent. Oiled parchment, scraped animal horn, or thin sheets of alabaster could be stretched across an opening. They bathed an interior in a muted, milky glow, but they severed the visual connection to the outside. The world was reduced to a shifting pattern of light and shadow. You could sense the time of day, but you could not witness the world itself. Light was divorced from sight. This distinction is crucial. It meant the interior world was a sanctuary, yes, but also a prison of sorts, fundamentally disconnected from the environment just beyond the wall. The Romans, masters of engineering, made the first significant leap with cast glass panes. Yet, as archaeological finds in places like Pompeii reveal, this glass was thick, greenish, and filled with bubbles and impurities. It was a revolutionary statement of wealth, a luxury that shouted status, but it offered a murky, distorted view at best. It was a barrier you could see light through, but not a lens you could see the world through. As we move into the medieval period, the function of the window becomes almost purely symbolic, especially in the grand cathedrals that dominated the landscape. Here, stained glass was the medium. Its purpose was not to provide a view of the secular world outside, but to filter divine light, to paint the sacred interior with stories from Scripture. The glass itself was the spectacle. The narrative was on the pane, not beyond it. For domestic life, the technology remained frustratingly primitive. When we examine the artisans' guilds and their records, we find two dominant, laborious methods for making window glass. The first was crown glass. A glob of molten glass was blown and spun on a rod at incredible speed until centrifugal force flattened it into a wobbly disc. When cooled,
the crown glass,
it could be cut into smaller panes, but the glass was thickest at the center, the bullseye, and progressively thinner and more warped toward the edge. Looking through it was like viewing the world through a ripple in water. The alternative, cylinder glass, involved blowing a long cylinder, cutting off the ends, slicing it lengthwise, and flattening it in an oven. This produced larger, more rectangular panes, but the process invariably left them with waves and distortions. For the pre-Renaissance scholar, naturalist, or artist, this was the state of the art. Their world when viewed from the comfort and safety of indoors, was a shimmering, fragmented mosaic. To truly observe a bird in a tree or the precise anatomy of a flower, they had to go outside, exposed to the very elements their homes were built to defy. A deep, intellectual hunger for empirical knowledge was beginning to stir in Europe, a desire to see, to categorize, and to understand the natural world with precision. But the very tool that should have enabled this observation, the window, was holding them back. The world was waiting to be seen, but humanity was still squinting through murky glass. The crucible of this transformation, the epicenter of the quest for transparency, was not a laboratory, but an island shrouded in smoke and secrecy. Murano, in the Venetian lagoon. Here, Venetian guilds perfected the art of glassmaking, turning it into a state-enforced monopoly guarded with a jealousy bordering on paranoia. When we examine their guild records and state decrees, we see a system designed to protect alchemical secrets. Glassmakers were forbidden to leave, and any who shared their knowledge with outsiders faced the threat of assassination. What they were protecting was the closest thing the world had to clear glass, but even their masterful crown and cylinder methods were bound by the inherent physics of spinning and blowing. The tyranny of distortion remained. The true ordeal was a battle against gravity and heat. The challenge was immense. How to create a sheet of glass that was perfectly flat, perfectly uniform, and perfectly clear. The breakthrough, detailed in early industrial patent filings from 17th century France, was a process as brutal as it was brilliant. The invention of plate glass. It began not with a puff of air, but with a flood of fire. Molten glass, heated to a precise, viscous state, was poured onto massive iron casting tables. A heavy copper roller, like a giant rolling pin, was then drawn across the molten river, forcing it into a sheet of near uniform thickness. The ordeal, however, had only just begun. This rough, opaque plate was the raw material, not the finished product. What followed was a Herculean task of labor. The massive plates were moved to grinding beds, where, for days on end, they were scoured with progressively finer grades of sand and emery. Finally, they were polished with felt blocks and iron oxides until, slowly, miraculously, a flawless transparency emerged from the cloudy slab. The cost was astronomical, the labor immense. For the first time, however, a human being could place a barrier between themselves and the outside world that did not compromise their vision. It was a luxury reserved for palaces and the homes of the hyper-wealthy, but its impact on the culture of seeing was immediate and profound. This wasn't just a better window. It was a new tool for perception. When we look closer at the art of the Dutch Golden Age, at the paintings of Johannes Vermeer, for instance, we find the window is no longer just a compositional element. It is the protagonist. It is the very source of the soft, directional light that gives his subjects such breathtaking realism and quiet dignity. Sociological studies of the period argue that the artist's studio was transformed into a laboratory of light. The clear, reliable illumination from a large plate glass window allowed artists to study the fall of light and shadow, the texture of fabric, the subtle contours of a human face, for hours on end, day after day. This consistency was impossible before. The window democratized the sun, taming it into a predictable tool for creating masterpieces. Simultaneously, In the studies and workshops of the burgeoning field of natural philosophy, the impact was even more revolutionary. A naturalist, for the first time, could sit at his desk and, through a pristine pane of glass, observe the precise feeding habits of a bird in his garden, sheltered from the wind and cold that would have previously cut his observation short. He could sketch the unfurling of a fern with painstaking accuracy, his subject lit by pure, uncolored daylight. As academic journals from the era show, this shift from fleeting outdoor encounters to sustained indoor study was the very engine of empirical science. It allowed for patience. It allowed for precision. It allowed for the systematic observation that is the bedrock of the scientific method. The window had ceased to be a mere architectural feature. It had become an instrument. And in this transformation, we see the true revelation. The quest for clear glass was never just about getting a better view of the garden. It was driven by a deep, cultural yearning to understand the world as it truly was, without distortion or interpretation. It was a technological struggle that mirrored the intellectual struggle of the age, a desire to strip away the murky superstitions of the past and see the universe with newfound clarity. The glassmakers, through their fiery trials and laborious polishing, were unwittingly crafting the very lens through which the modern world would first see itself. The window was no longer a barrier against nature, but a frame that brought it into focus. The elixir of transparency, once brewed in the exclusive furnaces of royal manufactories, could not be contained forever. The Industrial Revolution, with its steam-powered engines and relentless drive for mass production, took this elite technology and delivered it to the world. New processes, like the cylinder and plate methods, were refined and scaled. As patent drawings and industrial archives of the 19th century show, the cost of clear, flat glass plummeted. Suddenly, the ability to see the world without distortion was no longer a privilege of kings, but a defining feature of the modern home. The window had returned from its ordeal, and it brought with it a profound transformation of society. This was the dawn of what architectural theorists called the transparent society. The very skin of our buildings began to change. The heavy, opaque masonry that had defined structures for millennia gave way to lightness and openness. The window ceased to be a punctuation mark in a solid wall and became the wall itself. From the Crystal Palace of 1851, a staggering monument of iron and glass, to the steel-framed skyscrapers of the 20th century, architecture was fundamentally reimagined around the new possibilities of glass. The relationship between inside and outside was inverted. We were no longer hiding from the world.
Take a look at this view.
We were framing it, commanding it, inviting it into our living spaces with a newfound confidence. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than on the city street. The invention of the large plate glass shop window in the late 19th century was a catalyst for modern consumer culture. Before it, a shop was an interior space you entered to inquire about goods. With the shop window, commerce became a visual spectacle. Suddenly, the street was a gallery of desires, its sidewalks lined with carefully curated displays of fashion, furniture, and food, all presented for consumption behind an invisible, protective barrier. It created a new public ritual, window shopping, and fundamentally rewired the engine of retail from one of necessity to one of aspiration. And finally, the elixir seeped into our very well-being. When we look at the evolution of public institutions like hospitals and schools, we see a conscious shift toward designs that maximize natural light. Medical and psychological studies began to correlate sunlight and a view of the outdoors with faster healing, improved mood, and better learning. The window was prescribed as a form of medicine, a connection to the rhythms of nature that we had spent centuries trying to block out. It became an essential component of a humane environment, an acknowledgement that our inner world is deeply connected to the one just outside the glass. The triumph was complete. The humble window was no longer just a component of a building. It had become an indispensable technology for art.